Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the first lecture of the semester. Before we get into talking about Piaget, I just want to give you a couple reminders about how I would do this. Please check the other PowerPoint that I have for this day, or other YouTube video, I guess now, about how I would take notes about this. This is just going to be the lecture with a few reminders, but please check that out. And then second of all, please remember that these lectures are at times going to be pretty long, so feel free to pause it, rewind when you need to, take a break every 15 minutes or so, just so you're not kind of burning yourself out. Get a drink, something like that, primarily so you can keep being kind of as on top of your note keeping as you should be. And feel free at any point in time to send me an email with questions, but questions about the lecture are also good places to put or to find discussion questions as well. All right, so with that being said, let's get to it. So first, I want to tell you each one of the theoretical perspectives we're going over with is going to look pretty similar to this format. We're first going to talk about the background of the person in the perspectives where there is one big person at least. And then we're going to talk about the specific characteristics of the approach. On this slide, you can see some that are specific to Piaget, but in each of the ones we talk about, they're going to have some similarities. So, for example, each one we're going to talk about their methodology. And then finally, we're going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses and give overall evaluations of the theoretical perspectives. So, Jean Piaget, he was born in Switzerland in 1896, as you see. His father was a medieval historian and a, quote, man of painstaking and critical mind who dislikes hastily improvised, generalizations, and is not afraid of starting a fight when he finds historic truth twisted to fit respectable traditions. End quote. So seemingly a fairly serious man and an academic. His mother, he said, was intelligent but was neurotic, and that led to some family issues. And family turbulence actually led to some of his interest in psychology and psychoanalytic theory and the like. As a child, he was interested in many, many things, but especially the biological sciences. He was so interested in exhibits at Natural History Museum that he was actually invited to help the director there with the mollusk collection. And this led to later an offer for him to curate or be the curator of mollusks at a museum in Geneva, but he had to graduate from secondary school first. He was conflicted with his religious and scientific teachings, so he read a lot of philosophers as well. Durkheim, James, Kant, a lot of different people. He continued his education. He ended up getting a doctoral degree with his work in mollusks at the age of 21, but he didn't want to do that forever. So he spent some time doing a lot of different things, but in particular for us of interest is his time in Zurich in some psychological laboratories where he met Theodore Simon, who you might know from the Simon-Binet intelligence test. And Simon said that he wanted Piaget to help standardize their tests with Parisian children. So Piaget did it somewhat begrudgingly, but his interest got piqued when he actually started asking kids to explain their answers. Not just what was the right and wrong answer, but why. And he did this not just for correct answers, but also for incorrect ones. He really was interested in how children thought. This led to the publication of his work in a variety of ways, led him to getting a position to study child psychology for more time, which eventually led him to 5 books and made him a leading child psychologist, even though his degree was in biology. Also, he started taking more detailed notes on children, and specifically his children. And his notes on his children were actually responsible for a decent amount of his theories. They weren't the sole way that he got much of his information, but they definitely helped spur offer some of his thoughts on the topics. As we will see in a little while, he was also interested in how children thought of space, physical quantities, numbers, perception. And Einstein actually ended up hearing about his work and suggest that he look at concepts of time, velocity. I'm going to do that from time to time. I do that in class also for those of you who have ever taken a class with me before. I will mess up my words fairly frequently, so please bear with me, and I apologize in advance. But the things that Einstein suggested were concepts of time, velocity, movement, and this all helped lead to 2 books for Piaget. He eventually wrote over 40 books, 100 articles and chapters in child psychology, and he was tweaking his theories up until his death at age 84. Piaget is undoubtedly the greatest developmental psychologist of all time. There's a reason we're starting off with him, and we're spending more time on him than any other topic this semester. He's definitely the number one guy in psychology, in developmental psychology, one of the biggest people in all of psychology, and hopefully you'll gain an appreciation for that, why that is, over the course of this lecture. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the characteristics of his approach. And the first one for him is genetic epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. Piaget was interested in examining many subjects that philosophers had debated for centuries. How do we come to know something? Is objective knowledge possible? Are there innate ideas, or is all knowledge acquired? And he used child psychology as a way to answer these questions. It turns out he might have been less interested in the children themselves as much as he was interested in the children because they led to answer these questions, how we came to understand things, the study of knowledge. So the genetic part of genetic epistemology refers to development or emergence. So really, when we say it's genetic epistemology, we mean the development or the emergence of knowledge. And he said that by studying developmental changes in knowledge, that he could find answers to epistemological questions. And so while we might understand space, time, causality, etc., it seemed to him that children didn't know this. And understanding how they came to later understand it and know it would almost be analogous to one of us understanding black holes or the theory of relativity, things that are just way beyond your and my ability. Children can't understand space and time when they are young. It's just beyond them, just like the theory of relativity is to you and me. So how did children, and how do they go from not understanding it to understanding it relatively well? So essentially what he tried to do was marry philosophy and the scientific method, which in many ways is what psychology is, right? It's trying to take the things that you and I might debate philosophically and expose them to rigorous scientific method. He also took a bit of a different approach to epistemology in that thinking that knowledge is fluid and not a state. So instead of asking questions about eternal truths, Piaget was interested in how we came to understand some of these concepts that led to larger questions. Okay, so next up, biological approach. Because his first in-depth study was with mollusks, it makes sense that he himself was rooted firmly in biology. And he thought some traits of mollusks would apply to humans as well. He saw that mollusks would adapt to the world and adjust themselves to the environment in many different ways. So he came up with a general definition of intelligence, that intelligence is adaptation to the environment. That's what he thought intelligence was. And he said just as animals do this with the environment, people adapt to the environment, but they do it with the added psychological component that animals don't have, at least nearly to the same extent that we have. And he said also that cognitive growth is like embryonic growth, that the brain is getting more and more differentiated over time. It starts as something kind of basic and then will grow and grow and grow, differentiate more and more over the course of time. Okay, so now before we get into structuralism for Piaget, I got to give you a little background of structuralism broadly. So you might have covered this in Intro Psych, you might not have already, but it doesn't really matter. We're going to briefly talk about it. So structuralism was a kind of an area of psychology that was developed by two famous psychologists, Wundt and Tincher. And the basic idea in structuralism is to analyze the mind down to its simplest components, the simplest parts. Then you see how those simplest parts come together to make a more complex something, to make more complex phenomena. And the mind, they thought, had different elements, and they wanted to define them. So just like if we want to understand any kind of physical object, we might look at it down to its smallest level, the elements, the molecules that it's made up of, if you want to fully understand what something is. Well, they thought that in the mind there were these similar kinds of elements, but they were psychological. And if you could understand those, you could then understand the mind more broadly. Now, Piaget didn't fully buy it, it seems, but he thought that it would work theoretically in that there could be a small set of mental operations that formed structures that underlie our thinking. And that these structures would change over time as people developed. So that's kind of complex. So let me give it another shot. So he thought that just as Wundt and Tincher thought that there were these small set of elements that made all of mental life at the most basic level, that Piaget thought that there would be some mental operations that helped to underlie our thinking. And that these would be the things that change over time as people develop and get smarter. So in infants, they are called schemas. And you will see schemas from time to time spelled schemas. I actually spell it that way on some slides in future lectures because I go based on what the sources say. But for Piaget, it was as you see on the screen. But schemas are organized mental patterns that represent behaviors and actions reflecting a particular way of interacting with the environment. Say that again because it's important. Organized mental patterns that represent behavior and actions and reflect a particular way of interacting with the environment. So for example, the sucking schema in infants describes the way that infants systematically put various objects in their mouths. If you've ever been around an infant, you know you give them something when they're 6 months old or something, the first thing they do, they might look at it, but then it goes to their mouth. That's just the way they think, the way they deal with the world. Doesn't matter what the object is, they do it with basically everything. And we have these schemas with basically everything we interact with. And these are the underlying structures with how we deal with the world. So schemas then develop and become more differentiated over time. And children will, one of the first schemas that they will come up with after they have this sucking schema, children will then have a different schema for items to put in the mouth and items not to put in the mouth. So maybe some items they put in their mouth and it hurts them. They might then learn that no, I shouldn't put this in, but this is okay. Pacifier is okay, but a a fork that you find on the ground that's sharp, maybe not a good thing to just put on your mouth and chew on. Then those schemas will change again, and they'll have ideas of what to do with a pacifier versus a bottle versus a rattle. So some things you might suck in a certain way, some in another. Some of them you might not suck as many chew on. All of these things for infants change over time, and these are schemas. Now for children 7 and older, and this actually gets to one of the stages later, just keep this in mind, it changes at the end of one of his stages. But he described cognitive structures as organized, abstract mental operations. Now, I'm okay with you calling them schemas. I don't really care too much, but we'll get into that more when we get to the concrete operational stage. So cognitive adaptation for him is how the organisms interact with the environment. Remember, intelligence is basically defined by how individuals interact with the environment. Cognitive adaptation is how organisms interact with it. And Piaget said all organisms have an innate tendency to adapt and change to their environment. And this makes sense. You and I do this. So the way that you take notes for this class might be different than the way you take notes in different classes. And that's just natural because you are in a different environment. That's how it goes. Now, how this cognitive adaptation takes place is through assimilation and accommodation. The last 2 bullets on your point on the slide. Assimilation is where people understand and experience in terms of their current stage of cognitive development and way of thinking. So again, people understand and experience in terms of their current stage of cognitive development and way of thinking. Basically, they fit reality into their current cognitive organization. Now, in every encounter we have in life, there is a degree of what Piaget would call bending, or distorting your experience. You will attempt to incorporate any kind of experience you have and understand it in certain ways. People will apply what they know in order to understand the properties of events and objects, as well as their relations. There's a famous quote, "We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are," from somebody named Anais, I don't know, Anais, Nin, Nin, don't know, you can look it up. But that's the essence of this, is we don't see them how they are, we see them how we are. So you don't see optical illusions as they are, you see them as the way that you interpret them. Well, just like for illusions, for children, and even for you and I, we see things the way that we are. If I tell you that there is a puzzle that looks like a Rubik's Cube and I hand it to you, you might start first by trying to turn the puzzle around a little bit, just like you would a Rubik's Cube. Then you might have to change it if it doesn't work that way. Well, an example for infants of assimilation. Let's say that for you grow up, my dog is black. I have a black lab named Lexi. For my daughter, she could have thought, or either of them could think growing up, that when we talk about dogs, that Lexi is the dog. So all dogs are black, therefore. Dogs are what my dog looks like. So if she sees a white dog, she might say, that's not a dog, because dogs are black. From her current way of thinking, dogs are black, therefore the white creature over there is not a dog. Or you might see an infant call a flying squirrel a bird. They take what they are currently seeing, the lens through which they look at the world, and they apply that to some kind of new experience. That's assimilation. The opposite of that is accommodation. And that is where we change our existing ways of thinking, understanding, or behaving in response to a new stimuli or event. So we change our existing ways of thinking, understanding, or behaving in response to some new stimuli or event. Cognitive adjustments result from the demands of reality. We have to change how we deal with some things because they don't work in certain ways. If you are hungry and you have something that is really super tough, you can't bite it, you might have to cut it. That's just the reality of it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to eat. So when we see things that don't perfectly jive with our expectations, we have to take that into consideration. An accommodation occurs because our current structures, our current schemas, fail to interpret some event or object in a satisfactory way. So the way we are currently seeing the world isn't working. So we got to change it. You are an infant, you are given a bottle instead of your mother's breast. You might have to change how you suck in order to get sustenance. The nipple on the bottle might be different than mother's in terms of how much milk you get out of it. So you'd have to change that, or else you're just out of luck. The demands of reality are there staring you in the face. So you got to change it. So if you see a white dog and you call it a dog, even though you think dogs are black, you might say, oh, wow, look at that. That has similar qualities of other dogs. My dog, that's a dog too. Or they might see a flying squirrel and say that it is a bird with a weird tail. Even that, even just changing it a little bit, you now have two categories, birds and then birds with a weird tail, which they could then later over time say, we got birds and flying squirrels or something. So if you take these two together, assimilation and accommodation, these are a series of steps where we either say to experiences that this is something I know, or this is something different than what I know. And all of our lives, we are going through and experiencing this over and over again. Is this something I know, or is this something I don't know? If it is something I know, I will apply what I currently know about this object. If it is not, then I've got to change it in some way. So for Piaget, schemas, assimilation, and accommodation are key to everything. Last note on this slide. The earliest schemas that Piaget says people have are limited to natural reflexes. Reflexes are what we are born with. They are inborn, innate. They happen no matter what. We have a sucking schema. We have a variety of schemas that will then be modified through assimilation and accommodation, basically modified through experience. So we have different reflexes. They either work or they don't work. If they work, they can stay the same. We can eventually learn to do things without having it be reflexive. Many of our reflexes leave us early in life because we learn it. We don't need it to be reflexive anymore. We have now learned how to purposefully do it. Or we could accommodate. We could say, no, this reflex isn't working. We got to change it in some way. And this happens over time with experience. All right. So let's talk about his methodology. You will learn throughout the semester that I am a big methodologist. I really think it's super important. If we are a science, which in my mind we are, we have to have good methodology. So we're going to be hitting this relatively hard. So because of Piaget's background, he was well versed in observation and classification. Biology at the turn of the century was different than it is now. Right now, if you go and take a biology class, you might actually do some more advanced biology than biologists did 150 years ago, even in an intro class, because they didn't have the tools that we have. They didn't have the understanding of microorganisms and the like. So one of the things that biologists would do, or naturalists, if you want to go back to Darwin, that terminology, they would sit around and take super detailed notes about what animals did. And this was one of the reasons we have classification systems. in all animals, including humans, are the certain classifications. So Piaget would watch and record children just like he did when he watched mollusks. And he would also, though, different than he might have interacted with mollusks, interact with children and probe them. And this is what we refer to as the clinical method, where there's some kind of verbal interaction between a researcher and a child. So the researcher would pose a question, and then other questions arise out of their responses. And one limitation, but also a positive about this, is that the questions would therefore not necessarily be uniform. You could ask different questions to different children based on their responses to you. Although all questions are with a similar purpose in mind, they're all leading towards the same way. So I'm going to read you an encounter between a 5-year-old and a researcher. And if you listen, hopefully I'm not going to try to have a child's voice, but I'll try to change my intonation a little bit so you can see which one is the researcher and which one is the child. So the researcher starts out and says, "Where does the dream come from?" The child says, "I think you sleep so well that you dream." Researcher says, "Does it come from us or from outside?" Child says, "From outside." "What do we dream with?" "I don't know." "With the hands, with nothing?" "Yes, with nothing." "When you are in bed and you dream, where is the dream?" "In my bed, under the blanket." "I don't really know. If it was in my stomach, the bones would be in my way and I shouldn't see it." "Is the dream there when you sleep?" "Yes, it's in my bed beside me." "Is the dream in your head?" "It is I that am in the dream. It isn't in my head. When you dream, you don't know you are in the bed. You know you are walking. You are in the dream. You are in the bed, but you don't know you are." Okay, so hopefully you could follow with that relatively well. But it's a series of researcher asking a question, child responding, and then the researcher has the ability to either ask another kind of scheduled question or to probe the child to figure out what they're talking about. So just think, what are the chances of another child saying, if you said to one kid, "When you are in bed and you dream, where is the dream?" What are the chances that another kid would say, "In my bed, under the blanket, I don't really know. If it was in my stomach, the bones would be in the way and I shouldn't see it." Like, what are the chances of that happening? So you can't always anticipate what's going to occur. So this is simultaneously a good and bad thing. It's a good thing because it allows flexibility, but it might not be as good a thing all the time because it means you can't be uniform across children. But that's the essence of the clinical method. Later in Piaget's work, he added in the manipulation of objects, and we'll see that later in his stages. Also, in his methodology, children can't fully be questioned about their thoughts. So he and his wife, Valentine, who was also a psychologist, kept baby diaries with observations of their infants, and this included doing little experiments with them. And this might sound weird to you, but you guys kind of will do little experiments with your children. It's kind of an experiment when you say, you get like little toy farm animals out and you say, "Can you hand me the duck?" Like that's in a way, it's almost a little experiment, right? You're running them through a little quiz. So it's not all like they were in some bizarre relationship with their children. Okay, so now we move on to Piaget's stage theory. It is what he is best known for, although I don't think it necessarily should be. But it's also his most controversial thing, and we'll talk about the positives and negatives about the stage theory when we're done later on. So to Piaget, a stage was a time where children's thinking and behavior in a variety of situations tended to reflect a particular type of underlying mental structure. Basically, there's a similarity in schemas, at kind of a base level schemas or mental operations that children are using throughout. That's what makes these stages stages, and why the stage, instead of having one stage from 2 to 7, he didn't have 2 stages from 2 to 5 and 5 to 7, because he thought that through this entire time they were using similar similar mental structures. These stages could be thought of as sequential levels of cognitive adaptation. So just as species adapt to the environment, cognitive levels provide ways of adapting to the environment that are different because of biological maturation and with experience with the environment. So let me go over the 5 main aspects to his theory, not the stages, but 5 kind of qualitative aspects of his theory before we get into the specifics of the stage theory itself. So first, the stages are qualitative, not quantitative. And if you don't know what the difference between qualitative and quantitative is, you're going to need to know it soon, because that's one of the things we talk about with each of the theoretical perspectives is, are they qualitative or quantitative in nature? So qualitative is when there is a difference, a fundamental difference in kind or type, whereas quantitative is a difference in amount. So if you were to say that from one stage to the next, they go from being able to remember 5 to 7 words, that is quantitative. The number goes from 5 to 7. If it's qualitative, it means that you're going from apples to bananas, something that's completely different. Okay. So his stages are qualitative, not quantitative. So when children go from mental structures based on physical manipulation to structures that are mental representations, those are very different. So when he goes from physical manipulation to mental representation, that's his first to second stage difference, that's a qualitative change. Okay. Second, each stage comes from the previous one. It transforms the way of thinking in that stage, and also is preparation for the next stage. So if you are in the second stage, that came from the first one, transformed the way of thinking in the first one, and is also the stepping, the building block going to the next stage. So when we say that it is derived and transformed from the past one, that means that once you hit the new stage, they can no longer go back to the past one, which is why you and I can't think like children. We don't have the mental ability to think like children. Our thinking has advanced in such a way that that is gone. This, just as a heads up, runs contrary to Freud. And we're going to compare the theoretical perspectives all through the semester, so something to note. Third, it's an invariant sequence, meaning that no stages can be skipped. You can't go from the first stage to the third, back to the second. It has to go from one to the next to the next. Fourth, it's universal, meaning that all humans everywhere go through it. Some might not, and some might take longer. Some might not go through all of them. Some might take longer to get through them. But the claim that he makes is that stages will be found in the same order everywhere in the world. And then finally, the changes within stages. In each stage, there's a period of preparation for the next stage and a period of achievement. And these are gradual. So in the first stage, there's preparation for the next stage, but also a period where they are getting ready and actually accomplishing the things for that stage. Okay, so before I get into the big details of each of the stages, and we're going to go over them in thorough detail, I want to give you a heads up, a brief overview of what we're looking at. So there are 4 stages for Piaget. For his first stage only, there are real meaningful substages. There's a bunch of substages. The sensory motor period has a bunch of substages we'll get into. But the sensory motor stage is called the sensory motor stage because it is where there is an integration of senses and motor activities. That should be relatively straightforward. So again, what can infants do when they're young? Well, they can hear things, they can see things, they can taste things, they have senses. They then grab things and put them in their mouth. Then they'll look at them. They interact with them at that level. They're not thinking about, I wonder what is the genetically modified status of my food. They're not thinking like you and I think. It's a very basic level. So in the sensory motor stage, they understand the world in terms of their physical actions on it, where they go from at first reflexes to organized schemas. All right, the pre-operational stage is 2 to 7 years, and this is consisting of gains in symbolic thought. So this is where they begin to use words, ideas, etc. that represent other things. So a car means the thing you drive in, and a toy car is a smaller representation of a larger car. Before this symbolic thought occurs, a child might have no idea that there's any relationship between the toy car that they have and the car that they actually go and drive in, and that the word car means car. Think about what a 6-week-old child does. You talk to them, they have no reaction to it. The words mean nothing. It's not mental at that point. So 2 to 7 pre-operational stage. Concrete operational stage is 7 to 11 years. This is where they begin to use logic and reason. And then the formal operation, people develop the ability to think abstractly. So mental operations in the formal operation period are no longer limited to the concrete. They can be applied to purely verbal and purely logical statements, the possible and the real, the future and the present, things that are not currently in their way of thinking. Also, just as I gave you more detail now about the sensory motor stage than the formal operational stage, sensory motor stage is going to take by far the most to talk about, then the pre-operation, and then on down the line. There's more change that goes on early in life. So the sensory motor period. Remember that in his view, all life starts with reflexes. And reflexes are inherited ways of interacting with the environment that are biologically based. So inherited ways of interacting with the environment. So his first substage, simple reflexes. For him, this is the first month of life. This is where inborn reflexes are at the center of a baby's physical and cognitive life. Then gradually, as they activate their reflexes some number of times, some reflexes would begin to accommodate the infant's experience. So the infant might change the way that they suck depending on if it's a nipple or a bottle or a rattle or something. Basically, even within the first month of life, they gain the ability to discriminate at a certain level between these things. That's pretty amazing, even at a month old. And this isn't cognitive. They learn quickly. And it's not like you and I thinking, this is different than this. It's just they are automatically able to do this. Now, these reflexes go from reflex to later learned behavior. And Piaget also said that we have a tendency to exercise our skills. And this is why babies sometimes will suck even if there's nothing there. Sometimes they'll just be sucking on their hand or their finger or something. They do it and they get stronger and they learn more, and this allows for more that they can do later. So generally speaking, this substage is where infants strengthen, generalize, and differentiate behaviors that begin as reflexes. Okay. Substage 2, primary circular reactions. This goes from 1 month to 4 months. And this is the widespread and rapid development of schemas. And it's through primary circular reactions. So basically what happens, what a primary circular reaction is children will find something interesting. And these interesting activities could be repeated over and over and over again just to experience it again. You all have seen children do this. They like doing the same things over and over. This repetition might help the baby build cognitive schemas. And the main key here for primary circular reactions, as opposed to just circular reactions in general, is that a primary circular reaction is where infants' repetition of activities focuses on their body. So it might just be putting their thumb in their mouth, listening to their own vocalizations, grasping and releasing different things. It's all about their body, and they do it over and over again. And in addition to repetition, they seem to enjoy what they're doing. So it's not just that they're opening and closing their hand, but they seem to enjoy that they are doing that. They're learning to do these things. Okay, secondary circular reactions, substage 3. This is 4 to 8 months. Here, the actions are more purposeful, and they begin to act on the outside world. They will look to repeat enjoyable events that are not just focused on themselves. So they could pick up a rattle and shake it in different ways to see if it changes how it sounds. Basically, you have a schema about how to shake a rattle, and then they modify their schema. So the secondary circular reaction is a repeated action that brings about a desirable consequence that involves the outside world. So primary is all about them and their body. Secondary is about the outside world. In the last substage, in substage 2, shaking or slapping itself was of interest. Now it is the environmental consequences of their behavior that are of interest. Okay, now substage 4, the coordination of secondary circular reactions. So we already know what secondary circular reactions are. Now from 8 to 12 months, they're making a big step. This is where they begin to apply some goal-directed behavior. And this is where they take several schemas and combine them in a coordinated way to generate some kind of single act. They take multiple schemas and put them together in order to do something. In the past, their discovery of something that was interesting was just lucky. When they hit something, it made a noise by accident, and then they try to do it again. And they did it just because it was an accident. Now they are trying to do things in the first place. So they might push one toy out of the way to reach for another toy. That's multiple schemas put together, as opposed to just pushing one out of the way randomly and discovering another one along the way by chance. They can also use objects to make a goal. So they might take their parent's hand and put it on a remote control to make the box on the wall light up, the TV. So they're taking multiple schemas, putting them together. Substage 5, tertiary circular reactions. So we know what circular reactions are. What's tertiary? Well, these are schemas regarding deliberate variation of activities that bring desirable consequences. So they are deliberately varying their schemas. So instead of repeating activities, they seem to be carrying out miniature experiments. Piaget actually noticed this when his son started dropping things from his high chair in slightly different ways. Now, to you and me, this can be pretty annoying. Trust me, it's annoying when your daughter takes her glass or her cup of milk and just drops it on the ground. That's why you make the kind of spill-proof bottles. Get those. The sippy cups that don't spill, you want those, because they will take them and drop them from their chair. And this is annoying, but it's also awesome, because this is a sign that they are thinking about the world differently. They're noticing that when you drop something, the same thing doesn't always happen. Kind of like how if you take a football and drop it, it'll bounce in 1,000 different directions. Well, that's what happens when you drop these differently shaped objects. When you drop them on the dog, it might do something different. So they will purposely drop things in different ways because the world is their laboratory. And here, their interest is not just in repetition, it is interest in the unexpected. When something different happens, it's awesome. Okay, and then finally, substage 6, the beginnings of thought. This is from 18 months to 2 years. And here is where mental representation comes up. Now, mental representation is just an internal image of a past event or object. So they can imagine where an object might be that they can't see. And this comes along with the ability to pretend. They can pretend to be someone. This is also referred to as deferred imitation. It's not just imitating someone. You see your dad make a face and you try to make that face. It's you aren't around dad, you're around mom, and you make dad's face. So you're imitating them at a later point. So you can pretend to drive a car, you could feed a doll, cook dinner, etc., all without having to see it occurring right in front of you, as you would have had to earlier in life. And this is something that there's no real good place to talk about it in the semester, so I'll just talk about it now. But really try to think about how a child thinks. And we see this huge change from substage 1 to 6. That at the beginning of life, they are unaware of the outside world. The only thing that they can do is try to get their internal desires met. That's why they cry. They want food, they want to sleep, and they poop. That's basically all a child does immediately after they are born. So these reflexes are automatic. The child is not purposely doing these things, at least at first. So their entire life is not knowing that that there is a world. It's just them and their desires. And then slowly over time, they get to learn that there is an outside world. There are other things taking place, which is why you can have infants who are in terrible circumstances, in war, in the victims of natural disasters, and they'll have no idea what the hell's going on as long as they have their doll with them. Because the outside world doesn't exist. All that exists is when they are, is what is directly in front of them. And it's not until later in life that they can take into account that there are these other things. Okay, so this is the sensory motor period broadly. Now, before we get to the preoperational period, we got to talk about object permanence. Your book puts object permanence at substage 4, but it's actually not fully developed there. So object permanence is one of the most important concepts that's acquired in the sensory motor period, which is why we are talking about it and going to talk about it in so much more detail than the other things. Object permanence is the realization that people and objects exist even when they cannot be seen, heard, etc. So before this time, if you hide an object under something, as you see with this first child up here, mom or this woman takes a rattle, puts it under the blanket, and infant thinks it's gone. It is gone. It no longer exists. It's literally gone from existence. So in stage 1 and 2 of the preoperational period, when an object disappears, infants will not search for it. Out of sight is literally out of mind. It does not exist. Now in stage 3, they will search for the object if the object is partially hidden. So if it looks like this and you keep the rattle there, as you see on the screen, the thing that I'm circling, the child will look for it because they can partially see it. Or if they were participating with that object, if they were doing something with that object when it disappears. However, they won't search for long. They won't search for long because it seems like to them, in this stage 3, the object has become an extension of them, an extension of their action on it, whatever they're doing with it. So if they are no longer acting on it, it's gone. Remember what I said on the last slide, that to children, all that the world is whatever they are doing, at least in the first couple stages, the first several months of life. So the first 4 months of life, they're not looking for it. Here, now, the object kind of becomes a part of them, and as long as they are doing something with it, they'll keep searching for it. Oh, excuse me, I didn't think that would happen. That was fast, sorry. In stage 4, children have the ability to search for objects. However, they will only search for it in places where they have previously looked. So if you hide a parrot under a mattress to your daughter's left side, let's say, they will find it. But if you then hide it on the right side, even if she's watching for it, she'd look for it on the left. So let's say down here in stage 4, you take the object, you put it under there twice, infant will look for it. But if instead you take it and you hide it on this side instead of over there, the child will again look for it over here where they found it multiple times before. They've learned essentially a schema for how to find something, and it's pretty rigid. Even though they see you hide it somewhere else, they'll look where it was before. Now in stage 5, they would search for it. So this is after object permanence, they'll search for it. They know that it's there. However, if you were to, for example, take a coin from a hand, then put it under a cushion, and then put it under a cover, they wouldn't be able to find it. If you do multiple levels of hiding, that is too cognitively sophisticated. Then finally, in stage 6, they will look all over for it because they know it's got to be somewhere. It still exists in the world. So you can see a qualitative change in the way they are thinking. They first were thinking that an object is gone. Actually, it's not even how they're thinking, right? This isn't even a thought. There's not even a really good word for it. Schema, that's about it. Their schema is, if something is there in your presence, it exists. Once it's gone, there's no memory of it. Now, in stage 6, they understand that objects, once they exist, they are there. And so they'll look for it again and again. Now, why are we talking about this so much? Well, first of all, it's annoying when they finally get object permanence because they can actually look for things you try to hide from them. So if they have a book that they want to read over and over and over again, they know it's there even if you hide it. So it can actually be a little annoying. But really, the actual importance of it is it applies to people as well. It is thought that object permanence is the key element in the development of social attachments. The reason your children get separation anxiety, when do they get separation anxiety? It's around 18 months. Remember, let's go back 1 second. Remember here, substage 5 and substage 6? Substage 5 is 12 to 18 months. Substage 6 is 18 months to 2 years. Well, they're finally getting object permanence in this 5 to 6, substage 5 to 6, around 18 months. That's when they can get that real strong separation anxiety, stranger anxiety, because they want you. When you're gone, they know you are still there somewhere, and they want you back. And as we will see later in the semester, attachment is one of the most important things throughout life. So this is a super important aspect of cognitive development. Okay, let's move on to the preoperational period. Sorry about this. There we go. That looks better, doesn't it? The preoperational period. So the preoperational period is from age 2 to 7. And the first thing I want to do is define what an operation is, because it might help you understand or remember what the stages are a little bit better. So an operation is a, quote, internalized mental action that is part of an organized structure, end quote. Remember that schemas are particular ways of interacting with the environment. So an operation is an internalized mental action that's part of an organized mental structure. Basically, you can think of it this way. An operation is a fully mental structure. It's not a perfect analogy, but schemas are ways that you interact with the environment. Operations are ways you think about the environment. Okay? Good. So this is before things are fully that. It's pre-operational. Okay, now there are a couple key things here, but the biggest one in the pre-operational period is mental representation. And there are two types of mental representation: symbols and signs. A symbol has some similarity to an object, whereas signs are arbitrarily related. So, an example of a sign then. Signs arbitrarily related. The word table is arbitrary. It could be table, it could be Tafel in German, it could be a ton of different things. It doesn't matter. What the word that table is, T-A-B-L-E in English, is not inherent to what a table is. So it is a sign. It's arbitrarily attached. Table, for all we care, could have, back in the day, if in English they decided that table wasn't table, but schnur could be table. But it's not. Okay. Now, symbols have some kind of similarity to it. So it could be a mini car. A toy car is a symbol of a larger car because it's similar. Now, for children, signs aren't arbitrary. They are actually just as much a part of what a table is as the physical features of it. It's just as intrinsic as the color or the shape. So why is spaghetti called spaghetti? Well, it's because it looks like spaghetti and it feels like spaghetti and it tastes like spaghetti, so it's spaghetti. Spaghetti, the word, is inherent to what the thing is, just like a table. Why is a table a table? Because it's a table. That's just how it is. Okay, so generally, mental representation is the use of a word or an object to stand for or represent something that is not physically present. This is important. It's not physically present. So instead of something being used that is right in front of us, we can have an idea that something still exists, again, object permanence, that's not physically present. And in order to do this, you have to have also the mental ability, but also the memory to be able to do it. So now kids can see something and understand what it means a little bit more. So they might see you grab the keys and say, "Go in car," because they can understand that keys are a symbol for the car. Now, also, they could understand a model toy is a mental representation of a real one because they're related in some way. So, at the time, people thought that representational thought was only after the ability to use language, but Piaget actually thought it was the other way around, that you had to have mental representation in order for words to stand in for things. Now we now know that it's both, but nonetheless, this is one of the things that people had a kind of an academic argument about. Is language there before the ability to do this? Does your mental ability come before language, etc.? Okay, so mental representation. What are some of the other aspects to pre-operational period? Well, the first is egocentrism. And egocentrism is importantly not narcissism. Egocentrism is simply that children don't take into account the viewpoints of other people. They don't take into account the viewpoints of other people. And in fact, we might even want to say here, instead of they don't, it might be more that they can't take into account the view that other people have different viewpoints. So they don't understand that people have different perspectives than their own, and it is different than narcissism. And egocentrism can be in two ways. The first is that they lack awareness that others see things from a different physical perspective. That's the first. Second, that there is a failure to realize that others hold different thoughts and opinions and feelings than theirs. So again, the first is that people can see things from other ways and the other physical perspectives. They don't understand that. And second, other people have different opinions and thoughts and feelings. Again, this doesn't mean that they are selfish. So, one example, and I'm going to do this kind of through the course of the semester. I oftentimes give examples of my niece and nephew as well as my daughters. One time, my nephew was in a different room. There was a window into the room through actually over the kitchen sink. There was a kind of a view into the living room where my nephew Noah was. He was not supposed to be jumping on the couch, but there were no adults in the room. So of course, what does he do? He jumps on the couch, and that knocked something on the ground. So we were in the kitchen, but we were looking at him, but he didn't realize this. So we said, "Noah, did you jump on the couch?" And he turns and looks not to where we were, but to the doorway that we walked through to get to the kitchen. And once he turns and looks and notices we are not there, he can't see us, he says, "No." And we are up in the window going, "Hey, Noah, up here. Hey, up here. We can see you." And you could just see his little mind explode. Like he had no idea that we could see things differently than he did. Well, this is not because, again, he's narcissistic. He just doesn't have that ability to be fully aware of this. So he might not notice that this could occur. But another extreme example is hide and seek. What's a really good place for children to play hide and seek, or a hiding spot for them? They might just take a blanket and put it over their face. What is that? Not the rest of their body, over their face. Why does that work for them? Think about that. Well, it works for them because if they can't see you, you can't see them. If they can't see you, you can't see them. So if they hide, if they put a pillow over their face, over their eyes, such that they can't see you, then it's a brilliant hiding spot, because therefore you can't see them. Alternatively, they might hold up a book and say, "What does this say?" when the cover is facing their parents. You know, the words are facing them. They can see the words, but they can't realize their parents can't see the words. This also happens in peer groups. If you're ever around a bunch of 4-year-olds, what each of them is talking about might have nothing to do with what anyone else in the group is. They might be in their own little worlds. They could be playing together, but have completely different games in mind. I remember being around my nephew around age 4 at a birthday party, and they were running up and down the sidewalk, and each one of the kids had like their own goal. Like, "Oh, now we're trying to run to this tree. Oh, I touched it first. I win." And another kid would say, "Oh, we're trying to go down to this part. I win." And all of them would be in their own little minds, making up their own games. But that's just how it works. Now, they're actually less egocentric here than in the sensory motor stage. This is over time, it decreases. But in the sensory motor stage, their egocentrism is that they have a difficulty in differentiating between their actions and the properties of other objects. Remember, objects in the sensory motor stage, for most of it, are only the objects in terms of how you are interacting with them. Now, this declines over time, even through adulthood. It sticks with you. It's kind of most noticeable in the pre-operational period. Even in adulthood, this happens. You might ask people a question without giving them enough information to understand it, and you are not taking into consideration their viewpoint. It's not something that you're not purposely being an asshole or something. You just don't really fully realize that they don't understand fully what's going on. You have all of this information, but you might not realize what they don't understand. I face this also. If, as a professor, I use an academic term, if I use egocentrism and I assume that people understand what it means, it's me being somewhat egocentric, because I understand what the word means, and therefore I'm just kind of assuming that other people do. My wife does this fairly frequently. We'll be sitting there and she'll randomly say, "I don't think we should do that." I'm like, what are you, what are you talking about? And just completely out of the blue. Well, she's having a kind of conversation to herself and not purposely trying to leave me out of her conversation with herself, but she's just not realizing it. Everybody does this. You do this, even if you don't think you do. Okay, egocentrism. Next up, centration. What happens when you put a dog mask, a mask that looks like a dog, on a cat? Well, to 3 and 4-year-olds, they might say that you get a dog because they're limited in their preoperational period. Centration is the tendency to concentrate on one limited aspect of a stimulus and ignore others. I'll say that again. Tendency to concentrate on one limited aspect of a stimulus and ignore others. They'll focus on superficial, obvious elements within their sight, which makes them inaccurate. So, a 3 or 4-year-old might be centering on the dog mask. They might look at it. That's all. They don't take into account the size of the cat, the tail, if it says meow, anything like that. They might not take into account those things because they're focusing on one superficial aspect to it. Another kind of similar thing that we'll talk about later is if there are two identical containers, have the equal amounts of water in them, and one's poured into a taller, thinner container, children might center and look at the height and say the one that is tall has more than the one that's wide, even though they have the same amount. In addition, they do this with length. For example, on the slide now, you see these buttons. If you were to give a 3 or 4-year-old this situation and say which row has more buttons in it, oftentimes they will say the bottom one. Why? Because it's longer, but does it actually have more buttons in it? No. If you were to count those two, there's 2 extra ones in the top row. But they don't do that. They're centering on the superficial, the width. This one is wider, therefore it has more. Centration. Now, semilogical reasoning. The last two here are going to be fairly quick, but semilogical reasoning is where thoughts are linked together in a loose way, rather than in a logical relationship. So let's say one afternoon a child doesn't take a nap, but they regularly do. They might reason that it can't be the afternoon because they didn't have their nap. Doesn't actually make any sense, but it kind of does. You can understand how they got there even though you and I wouldn't get there. Or another child might say that when their friend was hit with a baseball, they fell down, or they got hurt because they fell down. Or if they're just walking down the street and they trip and then they get hurt, they might say that they fell down because they got hurt. They might reverse the direction of causality. So they're right that the two are linked, but they're wrong in how they're linked. And then finally, limited social cognition. Piaget thought that his theory applied to social objects as well as physical objects. So far, we've been talking mainly about physical objects when it gets to egocentrism, centration, etc. He said that it applies to social ones as well, that concepts like egocentrism would apply to people and social relations as well, not just in cognitive tasks. So an example, a French girl said that all Americans are stupid. If I ask them where the Rue du Mont Blanc is, they can't tell me. So this girl is limited in her social cognition, her social conception of what Americans are, because it's based on one or two personal experiences. All Americans are stupid because they don't know where this road in France is. Well, this is egocentrism, it's centering, it's semilogical reasoning. So all of the things that we talked about before with objects are applying to people as well as to social, or as well as to physical objects. Okay, so that's the pre-operational period. Now let's get to the concrete operational period. This is the active and appropriate use of logic. That's the number one thing. But Piaget sometimes lumped ages 2 to 11 together and said that it was preparation and achievement of concrete operations. So there are advances in cognitive ability prior to age 7. It's all in preparation for the operation. And remember from last slide what an operation is. It's an internalized mental action that is part of an organized structure. And we'll see here that the concrete operational stage is basically a time where the errors of the pre-operational stage are solved. So there's it's not so much that there are new things going on here, as many new things, as much as people are getting better at things that they were bad at before. And that's why he sometimes lumped them together. So I mentioned this task before, but we'll get to it now, the conservation task. This is one that is achieved here. If you put a tall, thin glass next to a short, fat one, non-conservers, or people before concrete operations are established, do not understand that if you take a pint of water and pour it into the tall, thin one, and a pint of water and pour it into the short, fat one, that they are the exact same amount of water. Or if you take water from the tall, thin one and pour it into the fat, short one, they would say that the amount of water has changed. Now, conservers believe that the amount hasn't changed even despite the change in physical appearance. Now, for Piaget, for someone to be considered a true conserver, they must give some kind of logical explanation, like you didn't add or subtract any water. So technically speaking, conservation is the knowledge that a quantity is unrelated to the arrangement and physical appearance of objects. Conservation is the knowledge that a quantity is unrelated to the arrangement and physical appearance of objects. Now, in addition to messing up this stuff prior to the concrete operational period, they're also not guessing. They think they know. They're pretty sure of it. So why is it important that we bring this up? Well, Piaget really cared about it, and he thought that it revealed that the presence or absence of mental functions was there based on this alone. He thought it was diagnostic. He said that you can't conserve unless you have certain mental operations, kind of like a structuralist might think. You take these mental operations and add them up. Well, for Piaget, if you add up certain ones, you get to reversibility and you get to conservation. So you have to be able to reverse things in order to understand this. So A plus B equals B plus A, basically the commutative property of addition. Or A plus B equals C, and C minus B equals A. You have to be able to do that if you are a conserver. Now, you might think that they're being ridiculous in this, but you and I aren't very good at this either. And the most kind of relevant example I can give for us is the leftovers. You have two different containers for leftovers. Which one do you put it in? Well, sometimes you might put leftovers in one and there's way too much room. You really underestimated. Or you put it in another one and you really overestimated how big the container was and you need another container to put the stuff in there. So we at least understand that if you have soup, leftover soup, and you're trying to put it in a container, that if you put it in a container that you think it'll fit, and magically there's not enough space in the container, that your soup did not actually magically get more soup in it, but just that the quantity might look different based on how you've got it. Okay, now also he said in this time period that people can understand the relationship between speed and time. So if you're trying to get from point A on the screen to point B, and you have route 1 and route 2, which car has to go faster in order to get there at the same time, for both cars to get there at the same time? Well, before the concrete operational period, people wouldn't know that this car has to go faster if they're leaving at point A at the same time to get to point B. They wouldn't know that. Now, a couple points about this. First, the acquisitions of these things do not occur at the same time. So some concepts like conservation don't appear until later. So it might be closer to 11 or so than earlier. And then also that this shift does not apply or doesn't happen automatically. So at first, they might do it the right way once, but then screw up 5 times. And then do it right twice, and then screw up more, and back and forth. 2 years prior to the full concrete stage, they actually flip back and forth between pre-operational and concrete operational. All right, so what is left for us here? Well, the formal operation period. In the concrete operations, mental abilities apply only to concrete objects, so objects that are present either mentally or that are literally present. And they deal with what is rather than what could be. The final step here is to apply operations to purely verbal or logical statements and to the possible as well as the actual. So formal operations is basically the ability to think abstractly. And you can take the results of concrete operations and then generate hypotheses about some types of logical relations, which would essentially be operations on operations. So thought becomes logical, abstract, hypothetical. And this way of thinking kind of resembles the scientific method, if you think about it. And I'll talk about this in a second, but think about the pendulum problem first. So this is the most famous way of looking at it. So the pendulum problem is where an adolescent would observe some kind of object hanging from a string and then attempt to discover what determines how fast that object would swing if you pulled it and let it go. So let's say you have, look at the screen now. So if you have a string hanging here and there's a bell at the end, and then you can grab the bell and pull it up here and then you drop it. You let it go and it goes zing, 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 zing. What? I'm sure you like the sound effects. So what determines how fast that object swings? Well, the people are allowed to vary the length of the string, the height where the pendulum is released, the force of the push of the pendulum, and the weight of whatever the object was that's hanging. Now, the before formal operations, pre-formal operations, they might be able to find the answer to the question, but they would do it haphazardly. In formal operations, they would vary one factor while holding all others constant. They might compare a long, light pendulum to a short, heavy one, for example, or a long, light pendulum with a short, light one, then a long, heavy with a short, heavy, etc. But they would also observe and interpret the results correctly and keep track of their results. So they would vary one thing at a time to systematically see how it worked. This is why I said it resembles the scientific method. You could have some kind of hypothesis, you check systematically things over time and get closer and closer to determining what the truth of the situation is. By the way, the length of the string is the main determinant. So while you get to formal operations by 12, it's not fully done by 15, and some people even don't get there then. Approximately, well, depending on where you look, only 40 to 60% of college students or adults ever get there. Some estimates have it as low as 25%. And it could be that the scientific process is kind of thought as the holy grail of type of the way to think in this, which isn't valued in some cultures or even in some majors. And so it might be limited in that respect, but we'll talk about that later. And while it can do good things, it can also be kind of annoying. So just as kids could look for hidden objects when they get object permanence, here children or adolescents can start to question authority figures, such as parents, and become argumentative, and their arguments can actually get better over time and annoy parents with them. But they can also become more indecisive because of this. All right, so let's put this together now. So what I want you to do is I'm going to want you, after I tell you what to do, pause the recording and think about the question I'm going to ask you. And that is, how would someone in each stage of development interact with the different objects? What's one way that they could interact at each of the stages with the different objects in this tub? So you have things that float, things that don't float. You got big things and small things, different shapes, all of that. How could kids in different stages interact with them? There are many different answers to this. I'm going to give you just some of them as an example, but just try to think of this to see if you understand what the stages really are. Okay, go ahead and pause. I'll just wait a couple seconds and then tell you. Okay, so in the sensory motor stage, remember from 0 to 2 years, you put them in the tub, they would splash around, they'd push objects, they'd chew on them. In the sensory motor period at the end, they might drop objects from different heights and possibly notice that some things sink and some don't. Some things make bigger splashes than others, but it's random, it's haphazard, it's more just kind of random play. From 2 to 7, pre-operational period, they might imagine that some of these objects are fish or boats or something. They might ask or might notice some objects sink and some float. And if you ask them why that happens, their reasons could vary. So one object might float because it's little, one might float because it's dry, one might because it's a boat, etc. The concrete operational stage, kids could be bothered that some float and some sink. They might make comparisons between them, but they would not be systematic, exhaustive comparisons. And in the formal operations period, they would probably think you're weird for putting them in a tub with all of these objects, but besides that, they would have a way to systematically figure out what influences floatability, for example, what causes something to float. So again, there are a number of different ways you could look at it, but those are just some things that they could do at different stages. Okay. So for each of the theoretical perspectives, we're also going to tackle 4 developmental issues. These are 4 broad questions that are asked of all theories. So for human nature, we are going to ask, what is Piaget's view of human nature? What's Freud's? What's Vygotsky's, etc.? We're going to ask that for each of the theoretical perspectives. So these would be good things to kind of compare and contrast over time. So let's start with human nature. His view was that life was organismic. Organismic. Basically that the world is modeled based on living systems like plants and animals, rather than machines. It's not as mechanistic as, for example, learning theory, behaviorism, for those of you who remember what that is. So an organismic viewpoint would look at individuals who are inherently spontaneous and active and self-regulating, as opposed to just machines. So, for example, you can only understand children's behavior by looking at their larger complex of systems that they are included in, such as their family, the economic situation, as well as their child. Piaget would take into account all of these things, or at least pay respect to them, let's say. For example, if a child is at school and having a hard time, and they hit each other or hit other children and are disrespectful to their teacher, what do you do? Well, it might be different if they come from a loving, good family than if they come from an abusive background, right? Piaget would understand that and care about that. Behaviorists probably wouldn't, and we're going to talk about them during social learning theory, but just as an example. Second question, is development qualitative or quantitative? Well, we have emphasized qualitative changes here between stages. There are some quantitative changes. So remember, qualitative changes are changes in type, whereas quantitative, it changes in amount or frequency, etc. So qualitative would be going from egg to caterpillar to cocoon to butterfly, where there's some kind of new phenomena that can't just be based on previous elements. Whereas a quantitative would be number that you can remember from 5 to 7 or whatever. And we've went over that again, but I'm going to do this from time to time to just refresh minds so we're on the same page. Now, Piaget said both, but that the stages are qualitative. But there could be quantitative changes in terms of the number of schemas that a child has. So relatively minor, but primarily qualitative. Nature versus nurture. So this is the question of whether or not it's genes or the environment that is the primary way of developing. Well, Piaget was an interactionist, meaning he said that development did not occur until there was both the necessary amount of biological development and the necessary environmental stimulation. So you needed both. And he actually came up with a formula. He said that development is equal to physical maturation plus experience with the physical environment plus social experience plus equilibration, basically plus assimilation and accommodation. So development is equal to physical maturation plus experience with the physical environment plus social experience plus assimilation and accommodation. So he said both were important. And then finally, what develops? Well, structural changes in schemas, in functions, logic, ability. Basically, structural changes are the keys. All right, and the last slide. Let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses for Piaget. First of all, strengths. The addition of cognition. In the 30s, 40s, 50s, there was nothing like Piaget. Nothing. Children's cognition was barely addressed. People looked at children as dumb adults, not as different beings. And that's a little bit overly simplistic, but it's not too far away. We'll see with Freud, he thought that you could look back as an adult on your childhood and talk about it as an adult, that adults could understand and remember things from their childhood in very different ways than what Piaget thought. So back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, people were pretty strictly behaviorist, where they would look at things through reinforcement and punishment. So much of Piaget's work wasn't actually translated into English early on. And so his addition of cognition was something that Americans were behind on for a bit. Second strength, new aspects of children's thinking. He made so many observations so carefully that he documented things that people had never documented before, which is amazing that people have been around for thousands of years, and he was the first person to put words into some things that children were doing. So object permanence, that wasn't around until he was there. It was, but the terminology wasn't there. The understanding of it wasn't. Rearranging objects that in a way that could change their numbers, at least 2 kids, that was new. But more broadly, he found that children take a while to develop, longer than we might think, and that their development takes steps along the way. And then finally, it had a wide scope. His theory is ambitious and looked at a ton of different areas. He looked at cognition throughout childhood, but also the transition to stages. And this followed implications of his theory, and also implications for other areas of development, most notably education. And while it allowed for a ton of discussion and testing. Now, he was not 100% right. You'll find that I am a Piaget apologist, though. I think that he did so many new and awesome things that his weaknesses, even if he wasn't right 100% of the time, who cares? He was fantastic. So with that being said, let's talk about some of the weaknesses. The first one, stage theories. Some people question whether or not stages are the best way to think about changes. Now, this is true for all stage theories. Critics say that instead of stage theory's view of development is almost like stair steps, that it's much more continuous, that it's like a slide as opposed to stairs, that or actually more like waves to be more precise, where there are some changes you get better, but then you go back a little bit, then you get a lot better, then you go back a little bit, etc., etc. And he acknowledged this, though, saying that stages might apply to only particular areas, but meh, that's okay. In terms of social and emotional aspects, critics say that his work is too grounded in motor activities. They say that Piaget overlooked sensation and perception along with social and emotional development. But there really was so little work on that, especially in infancy at his time, that it's hard to really blame him. Now, others have said that still he was very into motor activities, and they have found that children with no arms and born with no arms or legs develop normally cognitively. So there's no difference there. If you have a mind, you have a mind. It doesn't require the interaction with the environment, but that's relatively minor. But also that his theory only describes children from Western developed countries. And that there are timelines that are different from place to place. So one example your book gives, the children in the Ivory Coast tend to reach substages earlier than those raised in France. Third, the underestimation of abilities. He he underestimated kids pretty much across the board. Now, he said that children can't master object permanence until 1 year, but there's been some evidence that shows that they actually can get it earlier, and some evidence that kids as young as 3.5 months might have some kind of object permanence. But that's relatively small. But that goes along with his methodological barriers. Much of his research didn't meet conventions of developmental psychology, especially for currently. Today, he would not really be thought of. If he took his laboratory today, or from back in the day and just transported it to today, he would not be thought of as methodologically rigorous. Much of the work in infancy, again, was based on observations and observations of his own children, although not exclusively. Now, there are issues with the number of children he viewed, potential biases he had in interpretation, the absence of outside reporters, the lack of control environments. These are problems, and they really are. But even with this, much of his work was supported when it was evaluated in more rigorous conditions, which isn't meant to be an excuse as much to say he was amazingly right. But also, that's kind of holding him to standards that weren't applicable to him to people back in the day. So yeah, we can't say that he was the greatest methodologist for current standards, but that's true of us today. I make no claims that the way that I do research today is going to be looked at 50 or 100 years from, hell, even 10 years from now, and be thought of as super good. So I think we can cut him a little bit of slack. Okay, so we are done with Piaget. I know that was really long, but he deserves it. Hopefully this gave you a better appreciation of Piaget. Again, if you have any questions about this, go ahead and put them on the discussion board. You can now take the quiz on Canvas, open notes, so hopefully you took decent notes. If there's any other questions you have that maybe you're too embarrassed to ask in front of the discussion board people, go ahead and send me an email anytime. So we will talk soon.